It was late. The kind of late that stretches time, making every shadow taller and every sound sharper. I sat alone in my apartment, the faint glow of my laptop the only source of light, casting long, angular shapes on the walls. I had been up for hours, lost in work, barely noticing the clock ticking past midnight. The neighborhood was unnervingly quiet, as if the world outside had decided to hold its breath. I lived on the outskirts of town where houses were sparse and streetlights were few and far between. It was the price I paid for solitude. It started with the faintest sound, so soft I thought I imagined it, a distant creak like the groan of an old floorboard. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, ears straining to catch the noise again. Nothing. Shaking it off, I convinced myself it was just the building settling. After all, old buildings make noises, right? But then it came again. This time, louder and closer, a distinct shuffle like someone dragging their feet. My breath caught. I muted my music, the silence suddenly oppressive. I stared at the door to my office, the only barrier between me and the hallway beyond. My heart raced as I told myself it was just my imagination. Then came the knock. It wasn't on the front door. No, this knock came from inside. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the wall beside the office door. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The knock was impossibly close. My apartment was small, just a kitchen, bathroom, and this single room. There was nowhere for someone to hide. I mustered the courage to stand, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Slowly, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I opened it just a crack and peered into the hallway. Empty. The dim light from the kitchen barely reached the office, leaving the far corner shrouded in shadow. "Hello?" My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I don't know what I expected. A response, perhaps. But there was nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, like it's waiting for you to make the next move. I stepped into the hall, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Every step felt like a betrayal, the creak of the boards amplifying my presence. I reached the kitchen and flicked on the light. It bathed the room in a harsh, sterile glow. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The door was locked, the windows shut tight. Maybe it was a dream, I muttered to myself, trying to calm the storm raging in my chest. But as I turned to head back to the office, I saw it. A single handprint smeared in something dark on the hallway wall. I stumbled back, my eyes locked on the mark. It was too large to be mine, and the fingers were unnaturally long, the streaks trailing down the wall as if the hand had been slowly dragged. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." I grabbed my phone from the counter, ready to call someone. Anyone. But as I unlocked it, the screen froze. A distorted image flickered across it, a face. Pale, hollow eyes stared back at me before the phone shut off completely. A cold draft brushed past me, and I turned sharply, half expecting to see someone standing there. The hallway was empty, but the air felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't name. I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, the metal cool and slippery under my fingers. Finally, I yanked the door open and ran into the night. The chill bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I needed distance between me and whatever was in there. As I stood in the driveway, gasping for air, I looked back at the apartment. The single window above the kitchen glowed faintly. Then I saw it. A silhouette standing there, motionless, watching me. My blood turned to ice. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, a dark shape against the faint light. I got into my car, my hands trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. I drove aimlessly, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Eventually, I found myself at a diner on the edge of town, the neon sign flickering like a beacon in the darkness. I stumbled inside, the warmth and chatter of other patrons grounding me, if only for a moment. I slid into a booth, my hands still shaking as I ordered coffee. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed my state. "Rough night?" she asked. I nodded, unsure how to explain what had just happened. "Yeah, something like that." She placed the coffee in front of me and hesitated. "You live in those apartments on Maple? How'd you know?" My voice was wary. Her face darkened, and she glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "A lot of people who stay there. They talk about strange things, noises, shadows, things moving on their own. You're not the first to come in here shaken up." I swallowed hard, the coffee suddenly losing its appeal. "Why? What's wrong with that place?" She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. They say a man used to live there. Quiet guy, kept to himself. One night he snapped, killed his family and himself. No one found them for weeks. Ever since then, people say his spirit lingers, looking for something or someone. My stomach churned and I pushed the coffee away. That's just a story, I said, more to convince myself than her. She shrugged. Maybe, but if I were you, I wouldn't go back. Her words echoed in my head as I left the diner and sat in my car. I didn't want to go back, but where else could I go? Everything I owned was there. I couldn't just leave it all behind. When I finally worked up the courage to return, the apartment was dark and silent. I stepped inside, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. The handprint was gone, and the walls were clean. It was as if nothing had happened. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest, every creak of the building setting me on edge. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks.
Story number 2.
I always considered myself a rational person, the kind who scoffed at ghost stories and dismissed the supernatural as products of overactive imaginations. But all of that changed one night, the kind of night that burrows into your memory and refuses to let go. I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital, the clock on my dashboard glowing 1:13 a.m. The road I took was a lonely one, cutting through miles of dense woods with no streetlights and only the moon to illuminate the way. My headlights swept across the empty road, and the steady hum of the engine was my only companion. Then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the woods, just where the trees melted into the shoulder of the road. A young woman, no older than 20, dressed in a white gown that fluttered in the night breeze. Her hair hung in damp, dark strands over her face. Instinctively, I slowed down. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled up beside her. She looked lost, vulnerable. "Are you okay?" I called out, rolling down the window slightly. Her head turned slowly toward me, and for the first time, I saw her face, or rather, what should have been her face. Her features were blurry, as though I was looking at her through frosted glass. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it didn't change. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. A chill ran down my spine, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. But before I could hit the gas, she raised her arm and pointed down the road. Her finger trembled, and her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. I swallowed hard. "Do you need a ride?" She didn't answer, just kept pointing. Every rational part of me knew I should drive away. Something about her felt wrong. But there was another part, a deeper, more primal part, that urged me to follow her silent command. Against my better judgment, I put the car in gear and drove in the direction she pointed. The road twisted and turned, the trees crowding closer as if trying to swallow me whole. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, but the road behind me was empty. About a mile down, I noticed a faint glow in the distance. My heart raced as I approached it, the headlights revealing the source. A car overturned and crumpled, its roof crushed against a tree. Smoke curled from the engine, and shards of glass glittered like fallen stars on the asphalt. I stopped the car and got out, the smell of gasoline filling the air. My flashlight shook in my hand as I approached the wreckage. "Hello? Is anyone there?" A faint groan answered me, followed by the weak rustle of movement. I ran to the driver's side and found a man pinned behind the wheel, blood streaking his face. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me with a mixture of relief and desperation. "Help," he croaked. I called 911, my voice trembling as I relayed the details. As I waited for the ambulance, I stayed by his side, talking to him to keep him conscious. He was slipping in and out of awareness, muttering incoherently about something, or someone. She was in the road," he mumbled. "Who?" I asked, leaning closer. "The woman, in white." My blood ran cold. "You saw her too?" He didn't respond, his head lolling to the side as his breathing grew shallow. Moments later, I heard the wail of sirens in the distance, and paramedics swarmed the scene. I stepped back, watching as they worked to free him from the wreckage. One of the paramedics approached me. "You said you found him here?" I nodded. "Lucky you did," he said. Another hour, and he wouldn't have made it. I wanted to feel relief, but all I could think about was the woman, the way she pointed me here, her blurred face, her silent presence. Once the scene was cleared and the man was on his way to the hospital, I got back in my car. But as I drove away, a thought nagged at me. Why had she pointed me here? Was it to save him? Or was there something else she wanted me to see? The woods pressed in around me, darker than before. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I kept glancing in the mirrors. The further I drove, the heavier the air became, so like I was descending into some unseen abyss. Then I saw her again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the road, her gown glowing faintly in the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. My heart pounded as I stared at her. She was closer now, close enough for me to see her eyes, or the empty voids where her eyes should have been. She raised her hand again, pointing not down the road, but at me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her head tilted, and for a brief moment I thought I heard a whisper. Faint, like the rustling of leaves. "You should have left." The car lurched. I felt a force pulling me forward, like invisible hands gripping the hood and dragging it toward her. I slammed the gear into reverse, my foot pressing hard on the gas. The tires spun, the car groaning as if resisting me, but finally it broke free. I didn't look back. I sped down the road, the shadows seeming to reach for me as the trees blurred past. I didn't stop until I saw the familiar lights of town, the safety of civilization. I parked in front of my apartment and sat there for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind replaying the events of the night. The next morning I checked the news, hoping for some explanation. The man I had found was stable, recovering in the hospital. But there was another story, a decades-old tragedy about a young woman who had died on that same stretch of road. She had been walking home from a party when she was struck by a car. The driver never stopped. Some say she still haunts the road, searching for justice. Others claim she lures people to their doom. I don't know what her true intentions were that night. All I know is that I still see her sometimes, in my dreams, in the corner of my vision, in the moments when I'm alone and the world is too quiet, and every time she's pointing at me.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. The cabin stood deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, nestled in the shadow of towering pines. It was old but charming, its walls lined with weathered wood, its fireplace promising warmth against the chill of October nights. My best friend Megan had found it online and convinced me it would be the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. "It's just for 2 nights, she said. "We'll hike, roast marshmallows, and detox from our phones." I reluctantly agreed, more for her enthusiasm than my own desire to be stranded in the middle of nowhere. We arrived late on Friday evening. The dirt road leading to the cabin was narrow and uneven, the trees forming a canopy so thick it felt like we were driving into a tunnel. By the time we parked, the sun had set, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. Inside, the cabin smelled of aged wood and faintly of something damp. The furniture was rustic, the kind you'd expect in a place like this. A single lantern hung in the main room, its glow flickering slightly. Megan was thrilled, immediately unpacking and planning our weekend. But from the moment I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It started subtly. A faint scratching noise from behind the walls as we settled in for the night. Megan brushed it off as mice, laughing at my unease. "Relax," she said, tossing a blanket at me. "It's an old cabin. It's bound to make some noise." But it wasn't just noise. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps that creaked against the old wooden boards. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear more. "Megan?" I whispered, but she was fast asleep on the other side of the room. The footsteps stopped and silence filled the cabin. I held my breath, waiting. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, measured raps against the door. I froze, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it was a neighbor, though we hadn't seen another soul for miles. The knock came again. This time, Megan stirred. "What's that?" she mumbled groggily. "Someone's at the door," I whispered, my voice trembling. She sat up, her eyes wide with confusion. We both stared at the door, the small window beside it showing only darkness. No shadow, no silhouette, just the inky black of the forest. "Should we open it?" she asked. "No," I said firmly. "Who knocks at a cabin in the middle of the woods at midnight?" The knocking stopped, replaced by a soft shuffling sound, like something brushing against the walls. Megan grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the door. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No response. The shuffling grew louder, circling the cabin. It sounded like footsteps dragging through leaves, but there was an unevenness to it, a strange rhythm that didn't sound human. Then, from the corner of the room, a loud thud echoed, as if something had struck the side of the cabin. "Okay, this is not funny," Megan said, her voice rising. We grabbed a kitchen knife and a fire poker, our makeshift weapons trembling in our hands. We pressed our backs to the wall, watching the windows and door for any sign of movement. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence of the woods. We waited, hearts pounding, until the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees. "It's probably some animal," Megan said, trying to convince herself more than me. I wasn't so sure. We spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the events of the night before. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive stillness. The deeper we went, the more it felt like we were being watched. At one point, Megan stopped abruptly, pointing ahead. "Do you see that?" I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. Just ahead, half hidden behind a tree, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and draped in something dark, like tattered cloth. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. "Maybe it's a hunter," Megan whispered. "Hunters don't just stand there," I hissed back. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the figure. When we were far enough, we turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind us and locking it. That night, the real horror began. We tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the cabin set us on edge. Around 2 a.m., the scratching returned, louder this time. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if something was crawling through the very bones of the cabin. Then the doorknob rattled. Megan grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. We stared at the door as it shook violently, the wood splintering under the force. "Who's there?" Megan screamed. A low, guttural laugh answered. It was deep and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. The lantern flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, its weak flashlight casting long, shifting shadows across the room. In the corner, something moved. I turned the light toward it and froze. A face stared back at me, pale and gaunt, its eyes black pits that seemed to suck in the light, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing jagged yellowed teeth. "Megan, run!" I screamed. We bolted for the back door, bursting into the cold night air. The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying and groaning as if trying to trap us. We ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces and tearing at our clothes. Finally, we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. We jumped in and sped down the dirt road, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind us. Neither of us spoke until we reached the safety of town. We reported what happened to the police, but they found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone or anything being there. The owner of the cabin said he'd never had any complaints before, but his expression darkened when we described the figure. "You're not the first to see it," he admitted reluctantly, "but most people don't stay long enough to find out what it wants." We never went back. Sometimes late at night, I hear the faint sound of scratching at my window. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better, because once you've seen it, it doesn't let you go.
Story number 4.
It happened 2 years ago, but I still wake up at night drenched in sweat, the memory as vivid as if it happened yesterday. I was staying in a small town in upstate New York, looking after my uncle's house while he was recovering from surgery. The house was old, Victorian style, with creaking floorboards and heavy ornate furniture that seemed to groan under their own weight. The locals called it the Black House because of its faded black exterior, a color my uncle claimed had been there since the 1800s. It was isolated, standing alone at the end of a gravel road surrounded by dense woods. My uncle loved the quiet, but for me it was unnerving. Still, I figured it was just for a few weeks, and I could handle it. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was drafty and the wind howled through the trees, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. That changed on the 4th night. I was lying in bed, the lamp casting a dim circle of light on the ceiling. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows, and I was struggling to fall asleep when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like fingernails on glass. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my heart hammering. The sound was coming from the window on the far side of the room. I told myself it was probably a branch or some animal, but the pattern was too precise, too deliberate. Gathering my courage, I sat up and turned to look. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued. I reached for my phone, its weak flashlight barely cutting through the shadows, and slowly approached the window. When I pulled back the curtain, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there. Relieved but still uneasy, I closed the curtain and climbed back into bed. The tapping stopped, and eventually I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside the window. There were no trees close enough to reach the glass, no marks, no footprints in the soil below. I tried to put it out of my mind, convincing myself it was just the wind. That night, it happened again. This time, the tapping was louder, more insistent. I stayed in bed, too scared to move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. A heavy, oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. I barely slept, and when morning came, I decided to call my uncle. "Has anything strange ever happened here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He was quiet for a moment before chuckling nervously. "What, you mean like ghosts?" "Something like that," I said, feeling foolish. "Well, the house is old," he said. "A lot of creaks and groans, but no, nothing unusual." I didn't mention the tapping, but his hesitation stuck with me. That night, I decided to stay up and catch whatever or whoever was making the noise. I set up a chair by the window, armed with my phone and a flashlight, and waited. The hours dragged by, the house settling with occasional pops and creaks, but nothing happened. Just as I was starting to relax, the tapping began again. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder than before, more insistent. I swung the flashlight toward the window, the beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing but the reflection of my own wide-eyed face. Then something moved. A pale, skeletal hand pressed against the glass, the fingers impossibly long and spindly. The hand slid downward, leaving a faint streak, and disappeared into the shadows. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. My heart pounded as I scrambled for my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, but before I could explain, the line went dead. The tapping returned, faster now, like someone drumming their fingers impatiently. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed a kitchen knife and yanked the curtain open. The window was empty. No hand, no marks, nothing. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I was ready to leave. I packed my things, but as I headed for the door, something on the floor caught my eye. A single streak of dirt, like a footprint, led from the window to the hallway. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was overtired. Deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. I checked the locks on every door and window before heading to the guest room, the only room without any windows. That night, I heard the tapping again, but this time, it wasn't at the window. It was coming from the closet. I stared at the door, my body paralyzed with fear. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then the doorknob turned. I bolted, grabbing my bag and running out of the house without looking back. I drove through the night, the image of that skeletal hand burned into my mind. I called my uncle the next day and told him everything. He was silent for a long time before finally admitting that he'd heard the tapping too. "I didn't want to scare you," he said. "But the house has a history. The man who built it disappeared, and they say his wife went mad, locking herself in the attic for years. Some people think she's still there." I hung up, my blood running cold. A few weeks later, my uncle passed away. I didn't go back for the funeral. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that house again. But sometimes late at night, I hear the tapping. It's faint, distant, like it's coming from the edges of my mind. And I can't help but wonder, did I leave it behind, or did it follow me?
Story number 5.
I grew up in a small Midwestern town where nothing much happened. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and everyone knew everyone else. But there was one thing that set our town apart: the Hollow Man. Every kid in town grew up hearing the legend. He was a shadowy figure who lived in the woods at the edge of town, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. They said he had no face, just a smooth, featureless void, and that he whispered to people in the dead of night, luring them into the woods. Most people dismissed it as a scary story meant to keep kids from wandering too far, but I'd always felt uneasy about it. My dad used to joke that it was just the wind playing tricks on people, but even he avoided the woods after dark. It wasn't until I was 17 that I had my encounter with the Hollow Man. It started on a warm summer night. My best friend Sarah and I were hanging out by the lake, a favorite spot for kids in our town. The moon was full, casting silver light over the water, and we were laughing about something stupid when Sarah suddenly went quiet. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I stopped laughing and listened. At first, I heard nothing but the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, faintly, I heard it, a whisper. It was soft, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but it had a strange, rhythmic quality to it, almost like chanting. Probably just the wind, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Sarah shook her head. It's coming from the woods. We both turned toward the tree line, and that's when we saw it. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the forest, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and it didn't move. The moonlight seemed to avoid it, as if the figure absorbed the light around it. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, motionless, watching, or at least I thought it was watching. I couldn't see a face, just a featureless void where its face should have been. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. We hurried to my car, my heart pounding as we sped down the dirt road back to town. Neither of us spoke, the memory of that figure burning in our minds. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hollow man standing at the edge of the woods, his blank face turned toward me. Around 3 a.m., I heard the whispering again. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I sat up and realized the sound was coming from outside my window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The blinds were closed, but I could see a faint shadow moving behind them, as if something was standing just outside. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called Sarah. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy. "What's wrong?" "He's here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Who?" "The hollow man," I said. Sarah was silent for a moment before she whispered, "He's outside my window, too." My blood ran cold. Neither of us hung up. We stayed on the phone, listening to the faint whispering that surrounded us, too scared to move. It wasn't until dawn broke that the whispers stopped, and the shadows disappeared. The next day, we decided to tell someone. We went to the sheriff, but he just gave us a skeptical look and said, "Kids around here have been telling stories about the Hollow Man for generations. It's nothing but a tall tale." But Sarah and I knew what we'd seen. That night, I stayed at her house. We locked every door and window, turned on every light, and stayed up, determined not to let the Hollow Man catch us off guard. Around midnight, the lights began to flicker. At first, it was just the overhead light in the living room. Then the lamps started to blink, one by one, until the entire house was plunged into darkness. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. Before I could answer, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, coming from every direction, as if the walls themselves were speaking. The sound grew, rising to an almost deafening crescendo, and then stopped abruptly. We sat in the darkness, too scared to move, when we heard the front door creak open. Footsteps echoed down the hall, slow and deliberate, each step sending a jolt of terror through me. "He's here," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. We ran to her bedroom and locked the door, pushing a dresser in front of it for good measure. The footsteps stopped just outside, and then the door rattled violently. "Go away," I screamed, my voice breaking. The rattling stopped, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. Sarah grabbed my hand, her face pale. "We have to leave." We climbed out the window, our feet hitting the damp grass as we bolted into the night. We didn't stop running until we reached the sheriff's office. When we told him what happened, he sighed and said, "Kids, I told you there's no such thing as the Hollow Man." But as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the woods outside the window, and for a brief moment, I saw something pass across his face. Fear. Sarah and I left town the next morning. We didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't even tell our parents. We just got in the car and drove, determined to put as much distance as we could between us and that place. I haven't seen Sarah in years, but sometimes late at night I hear the whispering again, and I know he's still out there, waiting.
Story number 6.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not until I moved into that house. It was an old 2-story Victorian on the outskirts of a small New England town. The kind of place with creaking floorboards, drafty windows, and a reputation. Locals called it the widow's house. They whispered about its history, a tale of sorrow and madness. But the rent was cheap, and I was desperate for a fresh start after my divorce. The first time I saw the house, it was early fall. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and gold, and the late afternoon sun gave the place a warm, welcoming glow. I told myself the stories were just that, stories. After all, it wasn't like I'd ever believed in haunted houses before. I moved in on a crisp October morning. The movers unloaded my boxes, and by evening I was alone in my new home, sipping wine and unpacking. That first night was uneventful. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the house felt oddly comforting, like it had been waiting for someone to live in it again. It wasn't until the second night that things began to change. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. The sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I froze, listening intently. The house had no attic, just the roof. So there shouldn't have been anything or anyone up there. It's just the wind, I whispered to myself, but the sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment all was silent. Then I heard something else. A faint whisper, soft and unintelligible, coming from the corner of the room. I turned on the bedside lamp, the pale yellow light chasing away the shadows. The whispering stopped, and I told myself it was my imagination. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I tried to laugh it off. Maybe the house was settling, or maybe I'd had a vivid dream. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Doors would open and close on their own. I'd hear faint humming, like a woman's voice, coming from the empty dining room. Objects began to move. Keys that I'd left on the kitchen counter would turn up in the living room, and lights would flicker, even though the wiring had been inspected before I moved in. One night, I was brushing my teeth when I caught a glimpse of something in the bathroom mirror. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, but then I noticed the figure standing behind me. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and filled with sadness. She wore a tattered black dress that seemed to shimmer like smoke. I turned around, my heart racing, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the occurrences became impossible to ignore. One evening, I invited my friend Clara over for dinner. She was skeptical about my stories, but as we sat in the living room, the temperature dropped suddenly, and a cold, suffocating chill filled the air. "Do you feel that?" I asked, wrapping my arms around myself. Clara nodded, her expression uneasy. "It's freezing in here." Then we heard it, the sound of a woman crying. The sobs were soft but filled with despair, echoing through the house. "Is someone here?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, but before I could respond, the chandelier above us began to sway. The crying grew louder, and suddenly every door in the house slammed shut simultaneously. We bolted out of the house, neither of us saying a word until we were safely in Clara's car. "You need to leave," she said firmly. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But something kept me there, an unexplainable pull that made me feel like I couldn't abandon the house. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. Armed with a flashlight and a recorder, I wandered through the darkened house, calling out to the spirit. "Who are you?" I asked. "What do you want?" For a while, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard it, a faint, raspy voice that sent shivers down my spine. "Help me." The voice was coming from the master bedroom. I followed it, my heart pounding, and found the room ice cold. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the faint smell of roses lingered, sweet but sickly. In the center of the room, I saw her again, the woman in black. She stood there, her translucent form shimmering in the moonlight. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, she pointed to the floor beneath her. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I borrowed a crowbar from a neighbor and pried up the floorboards in the master bedroom. Beneath the wooden planks, I found a small locked chest. Inside was a collection of letters, yellowed with age. They were written by a woman named Eleanor to her husband, begging him to return from the war. The last letter was different. It was a goodbye, written in shaky handwriting. Eleanor spoke of her despair, her loneliness, and her decision to join the shadows. Chills ran down my spine as I realized what had happened. Eleanor had taken her own life in that room, her grief trapping her spirit in the house. I buried the letters in the garden, saying a prayer for her soul. That night, the house was quiet. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. I moved out shortly after. The house is still there, its dark windows, watching the world like empty eyes. Sometimes I think about Eleanor and wonder if she's finally at peace. But on quiet nights, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear her faint whispers. And I know she's still waiting for someone to come home.
Story number 7.
I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour gas station in a remote part of Wyoming. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. There were no supervisors breathing down my neck. but the long, quiet hours dragged on endlessly. The station sat at the intersection of two highways, miles away from the nearest town. On most nights, I'd get a handful of customers, truckers, late-night travelers, or the occasional lost soul looking for directions. But then there was the night I'll never forget. It was late October, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. The wind howled outside, carrying dried leaves across the empty parking lot. I was leaning on the counter, half asleep, when I noticed the lights flicker. At first, I chalked it up to the wind. The station was old, and the power lines weren't in great shape. But then the lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. I cursed under my breath and grabbed the flashlight we kept behind the counter. The backup generator usually kicked in quickly, but this time it didn't. I stood there, bathed in the weak beam of the flashlight, listening to the eerie silence. And then I heard it, a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the front door. I aimed the flashlight toward the glass, expecting to see a customer or maybe just the wind rattling the door. But there was nothing there, just the empty parking lot and the swirling darkness beyond. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No response. The tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the window to my left. I turned the flashlight toward the sound and my heart nearly stopped. A figure stood just outside the glass, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered coat. "Sir, we're closed for the night," I said, though my voice betrayed my unease. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head cocked slightly to the side as if studying me. Then it raised a hand and pointed to the pump outside. "You need gas?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The figure nodded slowly. Relieved that it was something mundane, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The wind bit at my face as I approached the pump. The figure stood by a black car, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. "What pump do you need?" I asked, trying not to look directly at the figure. It didn't respond. Instead, it pointed to the farthest pump, the one closest to the edge of the lot where the lights barely reached. I hesitated. Something about the car and its occupant unsettled me, but I couldn't exactly refuse, so I walked over to the pump. When I turned back, the figure was gone. "Hello?" I called out, scanning the lot. The car was still there, but the driver had vanished. I walked back to the store quickly, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I tried to shake off the unease by telling myself it was just a weird customer. But deep down, I knew something was off. Back inside, I checked the security cameras. The footage was grainy, but it showed me walking to the pump and no one else. No figure, no car. I rewound the tape, my hands shaking. The figure never appeared on the screen. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the monitor, when the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more forceful, coming from the back door. I grabbed the flashlight and a wrench from the counter and crept toward the sound. The door rattled slightly, as if someone was trying to open it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. Then the lights flickered back on, illuminating the store in harsh fluorescent light. I ran back to the front, checking the cameras again. The back door was clear, but as I watched the monitor, something moved in the corner of the screen. A shadow darted across the lot, heading toward the woods behind the station. I switched the camera view, trying to follow it, but it was gone. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't hear any more tapping, and no one else came to the station. When my shift ended at sunrise, I practically ran to my car and drove home. I told myself it was just a prank, maybe a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. The next night, I was reluctant to go back to work, but I needed the money. When I arrived, my coworker Jim was waiting for me. "You hear about the guy who went missing?" he asked as I clocked in. "No," I said, my stomach sinking. "Some trucker," Jim said. "They found his rig on the side of the highway, not far from here. Guy vanished without a trace." I nodded, not wanting to share my own experience. That night, the station was eerily quiet. Around 2 a.m., the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't go out completely, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it, the same figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the lot. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, its faceless head turned toward me. I grabbed the phone to call the sheriff, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't handle the isolation anymore, couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had visited the station wasn't finished with me. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the tapping again, and I wonder if it's looking for me.
Story number 8.
When I first moved into my new apartment, I thought I had hit the jackpot. It was in a historic building downtown with hardwood floors, high ceilings, and plenty of natural light. The rent was ridiculously cheap, which should have been my first warning sign, but I was too thrilled to question it. The place had a certain charm, but it also had quirks, odd drafts, creaky floorboards, and an antique mirror that came with the unit. It was massive, framed in ornate gold leaf and bolted to the wall in the living room. My landlord said it had been there since the building was constructed in the late 1800s. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. I was busy unpacking, adjusting to a new job, and settling into the city. But within a week, I started to notice things. The first incident happened late one night. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I saw something move in the mirror's reflection. It was just a flicker, a shadow darting across the room. I turned around, expecting to see my cat, but the room was empty. My cat, Oliver, was asleep on the other side of the apartment. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the dim light, and went to bed. Over the next few days, the flickers became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the mirror, shapes that didn't belong, shadows that seemed to shift on their own. It always happened at night, and only when I was alone. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air in the kitchen had grown icy, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I turned to the mirror. This time, the shadow wasn't darting or flickering. It was standing still, just behind my reflection. It looked like a man, tall and thin, with broad shoulders and an indistinct face. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were watching me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was in the room with me, standing silently in the darkness. The next morning, I called my landlord. "Has anyone ever mentioned anything weird about this apartment?" I asked, trying to sound casual. There was a long pause. "Weird? Like what?" I hesitated. "I don't know. Just noises or shadows, maybe." He laughed nervously. "Oh, you mean the ghost stories?" "Yeah, some people say the building's haunted. It's an old place, you know. Lots of history." I pressed him for details, but he didn't say much. Just that there had been incidents over the years. Tenants who moved out suddenly, strange complaints about the mirrors. That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the living room. I locked myself in the bedroom, but even there I felt uneasy. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of faint whispering. It was coming from the living room. I sat up, straining to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispering was soft, almost soothing, but I couldn't make out the words. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept out of bed and opened the door. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the windows. The whispering grew louder as I approached the living room. It seemed to be coming from the mirror. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the surface of the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. As I watched, the ripples stilled, and the shadow appeared again. This time it wasn't just standing behind my reflection. It was stepping out of the mirror. Its form was vague, more like smoke than flesh, but its presence was overwhelming. The air grew heavy, and a deep, bone-chilling cold spread through the room. "Get out!" a voice rasped, low and guttural. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not stopping until I was outside in the crisp night air. I spent the night in my car, too afraid to go back inside. The next morning I returned with a friend, Clara, who didn't believe in ghosts but was curious enough to humor me. The apartment felt different in the daylight, warmer, less threatening. Clara examined the mirror, tapping on the glass and laughing at my story. "See, it's just a mirror," she said. But then she froze, her expression shifting from amusement to confusion. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" She pointed at the mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw it too. A faint handprint on the glass, smudged and disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We decided to leave. I couldn't bring myself to stay there another night. That evening, I contacted a local historian, hoping to learn more about the building's past. What I discovered left me shaken. In the early 1900s, the building had been a boarding house. The owner, a man named Walter Grayson, was known for his cruelty. Several tenants had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and rumors swirled about Grayson's obsession with mirrors. According to the historian, Grayson believed mirrors were portals to another world, a place where the dead could linger. After his death, strange occurrences were reported in the building, all centered around the mirrors. I didn't need to hear any more. I packed up my belongings and left that same night, breaking my lease without a second thought. I don't know what I saw in that mirror, or if it was really Walter Grayson's doing, but sometimes, when I pass by a reflective surface, I catch a flicker of movement that shouldn't be there, and I wonder if the shadow followed me.